remember when Harry Lime sidled across Vienna's Prater to turn the scarcities of a war-ravaged city to his own profit? Well, Vienna is no longer that kind of city, and all that evokes that old Vienna is a musical memory. Today, in Western Europe, a Harry Lime would find meager scope. For now, in that prosperous and bustling continent, profiteering in vital necessities is not so easy. Now, in Vienna, Paris, and Rome, the Marshall Plan is so much a thing of the past that few can even recall it. How long ago is yesterday? Some of it, like Joseph Stalin, seems to be so far back as to be as dim as antiquity. The immediate yesterday, however, is still so close that to be reminded of it comes as a kind of shock. Rome, March 1957. A treaty signed by the 6 nations of the coal and steel community. Henceforth, it was to be the European Economic Community, or otherwise, the common market. But a common market, like Rome, is not built in a day. And even now, ordinary people who understand little of tariffs and quotas are less aware than they might be of the improving economic picture. But put it to them, and they will admit that things are far better than they were. For memories of the immediate yesterday on the political scene, let's begin in London. That city as conservative as, well, as only the City of London can be. And who were the Lord Mayor's guests of honor in the spring of '56? The state visitors from the Soviet Union were affectionately called Mr. B and Mr. K, or the Bulge and the Crush. Mr. B, Comrade Bulganin, and Mr. K, soon to prove the real power, Comrade Khrushchev. Faces smiled in keeping with a new policy termed peaceful coexistence. But behind lay a reality too grim for smiles. Across Germany sprawled a curtain, iron in fact as well as in name. Though leaders might sport in foreign capitals, for their people, peaceful coexistence was no more than a theory. November 1956, and Budapest is strewn with wreckage and corpses. A rising by Hungarians seeking minimal freedoms has been met by the clinching argument of tanks and guns. May 1960, and Mr. Khrushchev is to give a press conference. The place is Paris, where yet another summit meeting is disintegrating because of Soviet stonewalling. Unwilling to continue discussions with the West, Mr. K is nonetheless keen to have an audience. Excellent copy that he is, the press likes Mr. K. And Mr. K likes them. But after the applause comes the rub. What was the use, he would like to know, of the Russians cooperating over the conference table when American planes were spying over the Soviet Union? In Moscow, he had the wreckage of a U-2, its special gear, and its pilot. Explain that, demands injured Mr. K.
И будете опять готовить нападение, мы так пуснем, что больше не будет шуток.
The U-2 has given Mr. Khrushchev his excuse to end a summit meeting that is embarrassing him, and to take his leave. The next scene, New York, September 1962. The United Nations General Assembly. These were the days when this normally somewhat staid gathering was to be enlivened by Comrade Khrushchev. Because neither the Secretary General nor the Assembly at large would yield to Russian demands for a reorganization favoring the Soviet bloc, the Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, was singled out for special treatment. But the Secretary General is not the only target, as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan soon discovers. Like the charge of the Light Brigade, it is magnificent, but is it diplomacy? For millions of out-of-town visitors to New York, the United Nations building is but a tiny part of the great spectacle which is Manhattan. Here, amid all the symbols of wealth and power, foreign affairs are apt to seem as distant as though viewed through the wrong end of a telescope. A great nation, subject to no real threat of foreign invasion since the War of Independence. Imagine then the shock of the events of 1962. In the White House, a deeply disturbed President Kennedy consults with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Mr. Gromyko. Like a sudden nightmare, the world is faced with what seems to be inevitable nuclear warfare. Why this nightmare? And who is responsible? In the United Nations, a bearded, uniformed figure strides to the dais to deliver one of its long harangues against the United States. In this, there is nothing particularly new, neither in the form nor in the long-windedness. This is Fidel Castro of Cuba. What is new is that American photo reconnaissance planes flying over Cuba have supplied evidence of a series of rocket sites armed with Soviet weapons capable of subjecting the very heartland of the United States to close-range attack. An anxious United Nations Security Council listens to the United States representative, Mr. Adlai Stevenson.
We now know that the Soviet Union, not content with Dr. Castro's oath of fealty, not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun.
John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev had once met in Vienna. Their meeting established a hotline. Now, when every minute counted, over that hotline, President Kennedy gave the choice. Not long afterwards, reconnaissance planes were able to report that ships sailing out of Cuba were carrying decked cargoes of rockets being returned to the Soviet Union. The world balance of power, which had been deliberately and dangerously tilted, was thus restored, thanks to the firmness of the American president. Can it be said that since the Cuban crisis, the good citizens of the United States have read the foreign news in their papers with just that shade more attention? What can be said is that they are now fully aware that the emphasis has swung away from the old political chessboard of Europe and onto the twin masses of themselves and the peoples of the Soviet Union. These days there are skyscrapers in Moscow, skyscrapers and drink dispensers and pre-packaging and telephones and television. In Moscow, the big store is called Gum. But inside, it's much like any other department store. Can this new consumer demand mean that in Russia today, materialism is infiltrating its decadent influence? In his tomb in Red Square, Lenin now lies alone. Comrade Stalin has been removed. Comrade Khrushchev, too, passed from the scene at the end of '64. As the Russians will tell you, it is not personalities that count, but policy. Now, in the streets of Moscow, the people seem to have their eyes fixed on more distant targets, on the heavens, on the way to the stars. But the way to the stars lies also through the Brandenburg Gate. In Berlin, bricks, mortar, wire, and every kind of fiendish contraption make up what decent people call the wall of shame. Today, because the East maintains the uneasy status quo, Americans, British, and French must still patrol the wall they detest, just in case. On the other side, East German police work to make their defenses even more impregnable. Defenses designed not to keep out, but to keep in. Witness the memorials to those who tried to pass and failed. On this side of the wall, children play against its stones, as they will play anywhere. When Khrushchev was retired, 20 years after the Second World War, the young people of Europe inherited a divided Berlin, a divided Germany, and no final post-war settlement of the European problem. In the early 1960s, the means by which it was hoped such a settlement might be reached was called peaceful coexistence, a phrase first used by the East. In the late 60s, the West produced the single word détente to describe the policy, NATO's policy, of attempting by every possible political and diplomatic means to bridge the gaps between East and West, and by so doing to solve all the problems that beset Europe. This film stopped where it did because what happened after 1965 is not yet history, but still part of the Europe we live in today. A Europe of new ideas, of young people, many of whom never knew the hopes and the disappointments of those 20 years, those 2 decades which future historians may well come to regard as a turning point in world history.